They say betrayal doesn't come from your enemies, it comes from the people you trust the most. And for Richard Bennett, a hardworking man from Boise, Idaho, betrayal didn't just creep into his life, it exploded in front of the entire neighborhood, leaving his wife humiliated, her lover destroyed, and his own reputation surprisingly intact. This is not a story about quiet heartbreak. It's not a story about simply walking away from infidelity. No, this is a story about revenge, about consequences, and about what happens when one man decides that instead of screaming or begging for the truth, he will let fate, helped along by a little industrial adhesive, do the talking. But before we get to the infamous night when sirens lit up Maple Street and a crowd gathered to witness something they would never forget, we need to rewind. Because every disaster has a beginning. And this one began in a marriage that once looked like the picture of devotion. Richard wasn't always a landscaper. Once upon a time, he was a factory worker covered in sawdust, dreaming of starting something of his own. When he met Molly, she was young, energetic, full of ambition. She had a degree in exercise science and dreams of opening her own fitness studio. Together, they built a life. Molly supported Richard when he quit his job at the mill to start Bennett Landscaping. She pulled double shifts at the gym, worked herself ragged, but she believed in him. And when Richard landed his first commercial contract, Molly cried with relief. They were a team driving each other to work, sharing late-night takeout, whispering about the kids they would one day have. For years, life felt good, comfortable, honest, until one day, it didn't. At first, Richard blamed work. Landscaping meant long, exhausting hours in the summer. Molly's schedule at the community center was hectic too. Slowly, their conversations grew shorter. They still sat in the same room, but it was like there was a wall between them. Then came the little things, Molly showering immediately after getting home, her phone never leaving her hand. Late-night staff meetings that stretched past the community center's closing time. Richard wanted to believe her. He wanted to think it was just stress, just work, but suspicion grows like weeds. You don't even notice it until it's choking everything. The breaking point came when Richard decided to clean Molly's car. It was supposed to be a small act of love. Instead, under the passenger seat, he found a small, clear tube with a blue cap. Personal lubricant, a brand they had never bought, a brand that wasn't meant for him. He put it back exactly where he found it. Didn't confront her, didn't shout. He just watched and waited. Now pause for a second. This is where many of us would explode. We'd storm into the house, demand answers, threaten divorce. But Richard didn't. He understood something powerful when a liar is committed to their story. Confrontation just gives them another chance to practice their lines. Instead of demanding explanations, Richard gathered evidence. He noticed Molly's workout clothes were pristine, never sweaty. He saw her car parked outside a CrossFit gym. Even though she claimed she was at the grocery store, he asked casual questions, only to be fed shaky excuses. Richard wasn't stupid. He knew. And once he knew, the question wasn't, is she cheating? The question became, what am I going to do about it? Richard expected to feel rage when the truth sank in, but instead, he felt calm. It was the kind of calm that comes when a puzzle finally clicks into place. The late nights, the new wardrobe, the phone glued to her palm, the tube under the seat. His wife wasn't just drifting away, she was already gone. And in her place stood a liar who looked him in the eye every night and pretended. But here's the thing about calm, it doesn't mean surrender. For Richard, calm was clarity. And clarity meant he could finally make a choice. Some people leave, some people forgive. Richard decided to teach a lesson. On Monday morning, Richard drove to Hartley Hardware, to the outside world. It looked like any normal errand, a man in dusty jeans buying supplies for another job. But in his head, he was sketching out a blueprint of consequences. Frank, the clerk, had known him for years. Planning a project, he asked as he slid a tube of industrial strength adhesive across the counter. Something like that, Richard replied. And it wasn't a lie. He was planning something just not the kind of project Frank imagined. Back home, in the quiet of his workshop, Richard unscrewed the cap of the lubricant he'd found. With steady hands, he poured it into an empty container, then filled the original tube with adhesive. The color matched perfectly. The consistency was close enough. Unless you squeezed hard, you'd never know. He placed the doctored tube back under Molly's passenger seat like resetting a loaded trap, and then he waited. By Thursday, Molly had her story ready. "Girls' night," she said, casually buttering toast. Her tone was rehearsed, like she'd practiced the line. "We're trying out that new wine bar downtown." Richard nodded, sipping his coffee. He knew every wine bar in town. There was no new place on Main Street. But why correct her? Why waste the energy? Instead, he let her lie. He let her curl her hair, slip into black jeans that fit like they were stitched for sin, and spray on perfume he hadn't smelled in months. She thought she was getting away with it. He knew better. That night, Richard clipped Chester's leash and strolled past Maple Street. The rental house that had sat empty for weeks was suddenly alive with a black Jeep in the driveway and a tall figure moving inside. Moments later, Molly's SUV pulled in beside it. There was no wine, no girlfriends, just betrayal in full view. Richard didn't storm in. He didn't shout or pound on the door. He simply walked home with Chester, gave the dog a treat, and opened a beer. Then, at 9:37 p.m., it began. A scream, high-pitched, panicked, followed by male shouting, then more screaming. The sound of chaos spilled into the neighborhood. Porch lights flicked on, curtains twitched. Old Mr. Garrett shuffled out in his bathrobe, confused, inside the rental. Panic was unfolding. The adhesive had worked. The lovers were bonded literally, and no matter how hard they pulled, they couldn't separate. Neighbors whispered, someone called 911. Within minutes, sirens wailed, painting the street in red and blue. Firefighters, paramedics, all arriving to a scene none of them had ever trained for. Richard stood at his window, sipping his beer. As the crowd grew, voices outside buzzed with confusion. What's happening? Why are they screaming? He didn't have to guess. He already knew. And here's the irony: Richard never laid a hand on Molly. He never shouted, never cursed, never broke a single law. All he did was set the stage and step back. When people betray you, sometimes the cruelest justice is letting them destroy themselves. That night, as firefighters struggled to separate Molly and her lover, Richard realized something profound: revenge doesn't always require violence. Sometimes, it only requires patience and the right tool from the hardware aisle. By 9:45 p.m., the chaos on Maple Street had reached its peak. Neighbors gathered on porches in their pajamas, whispering to one another. Mrs. Henderson pressed her face to the window, then shouted to Richard across their shared fence. "Do you hear that? Should we call someone?" Richard shook his head with the faintest smirk. "Sounds like someone's having a rough night." But Mrs. Henderson wasn't convinced. Minutes later, she dialed 911, her voice trembling as she reported screaming, shouting, and some kind of emergency. Within minutes, the fire truck, then the ambulance, then police cruisers rolled onto Maple Street. Lights flashing. Red and blue painted the houses, casting a surreal glow. EMTs rushed inside, only to reappear minutes later with baffled expressions. They whispered among themselves, then returned with equipment Richard had never seen before: solvents, shears, towels. And then the stretcher appeared. Two figures, covered in white sheets up to their necks, strapped side by side, unable to separate. The crowd gasped. Phones came out. A murmur swept through the neighborhood. Something had gone horribly, hilariously wrong. By Friday morning, the gossip machine was unstoppable. Richard's neighbor Dave texted him before sunrise. "Dude, did you hear about the ambulance last night? Craziest thing I've ever seen." Mrs. Patterson. The unofficial gossip queen of the block, cornered Richard during his morning walk with Chester. She shook her head, half in horror, half in delight. "Most ridiculous thing I've ever seen," she whispered. "The fire department had to come out around 10. Two people, stuck together somehow. Couldn't separate them without surgery. My grandson took a video, already posted it online." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "They say it's going viral." Richard feigned surprise, nodding politely. But inside he knew exactly what had happened. His trap had sprung and the world was now watching the results. By noon, Richard no longer needed neighbors to tell him. The evidence was right there on social media. Mrs. Patterson's grandson had uploaded shaky phone footage paramedics wheeling two people out of the Maple Street rental house. Both clearly stuck together under towels, their faces twisted in panic. The caption, "When Netflix and chill goes horribly wrong." Firefighters needed industrial solvent to separate these two. Within hours, the video had 50,000 views. By evening, local news stations had picked it up. Headlines screamed, "Boise couple's romantic night ends in industrial accident." Comments poured in, "This is the funniest thing I've ever seen. Who brings glue to a hookup?" These two just set a new standard for stuck together. For Molly, humiliation wasn't just private anymore, it was global. By that afternoon, Richard received a message from the community center. "All fitness classes with Molly Bennett are cancelled due to a staffing emergency." An hour later, Molly herself called, her voice flat. "Trembling, I need you to pick me up from the hospital." When Richard arrived, he found her pale, defeated, dressed in borrowed scrubs, her own clothes sealed in a plastic bag. "Allergic reaction," she muttered, "some kind of adhesive." Richard didn't press. He didn't ask why her SUV was still at Maple Street, or why she'd been taken to a hospital across town. He simply drove her home in silence, letting her sit in the weight of her own shame. And here's where Richard's revenge became something bigger than he ever expected. He hadn't posted the video, he hadn't called the news. But the internet doesn't need permission, it just needs a story. And this was the kind of story people devoured. Molly's humiliation was no longer between husband and wife. It was trending. It was viral. It was in the group chats of her co-workers, the whispers of parents at the community center, the gossip at every CrossFit gym in town. Richard didn't have to raise his voice. The world did it for him. By Saturday morning, the consequences came crashing down. Molly's supervisor at the community center called with a sharp tone, "We need to talk about professional standards." It wasn't about adultery officially. Organizations rarely use words like that. Instead, it was about public image, conduct unbecoming, and unwanted attention. But Richard knew what it really meant. The viral video was bad for business. Parents had already begun emailing the center, furious that the fitness instructor their children looked up to was now the star of a scandal. By Monday, Molly was fired. And she wasn't alone. Travis, the 28-year-old personal trainer she had risked everything for, was swiftly terminated as well. His gym owner released a statement about family-friendly values and commitment to professionalism. His CrossFit certification board revoked his license permanently, citing damage to the industry's reputation. In the span of 72 hours, both lovers lost not just their jobs, but their careers. For Richard, there was no screaming match, no shattered dishes, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, there was paperwork. Cold, clean, efficient. He filed for divorce 3 weeks later. Molly tried to argue, tried to salvage pieces of dignity, but the evidence was insurmountable. The humiliation, the lies, the viral video, all of it was now public record. When the divorce was finalized, Richard didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. His victory wasn't about gloating, it was about freedom. Molly moved in with her sister temporarily. Travis, humiliated and unable to find work, vanished. He deleted his social media accounts, changed his number, and left Boise altogether. The woman who once dreamed of opening her own fitness studio now found herself unemployed, shunned by the community, and reduced to whispers of pity every time she walked into a grocery store. Boise wasn't a big city. People remembered. They whispered, they pointed. At first, Molly tried to brave it out, picking up groceries, running errands, even attempting to reapply for local jobs. But everywhere she went, the viral video followed her. Parents didn't want her near their kids' programs. Gyms didn't want the PR nightmare. Even casual encounters in coffee shops ended with someone whispering, "That's her." The one from the video. Within a year, Molly left town. She moved to Portland, hoping for a fresh start. She picked up part-time hours at a yoga studio. But even there, questions about her past followed. Why had she left her old job? What was the gap in her resume? Richard never asked. He didn't need to. Through it all, Richard remained steady. He kept running his landscaping business, kept walking Chester every night, kept his head down while the storm swirled around him. Neighbors often stopped him, asking if he was okay, as though he were the victim. And in some ways, he was. But unlike Molly, Richard didn't wear his scars on the outside. He carried them quietly, with dignity. He even began dating again a divorced teacher named Catherine, who lived across town with 2 teenage kids. She was straightforward, kind, and most importantly honest. No games, no mysterious late nights, no hidden phones. Richard didn't talk much about Molly. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew the story, and he had no interest in reliving it. For him, revenge wasn't about destroying Molly, it was about reclaiming his life. And he had done just that. And here lies the brutal irony of betrayal. Molly thought she was trading up, chasing excitement, sneaking away for passion in rental houses and SUVs. Instead, she traded stability for scandal, love for humiliation, and a marriage for a meme. Richard didn't scream. He didn't hit. He didn't break the law. All he did was let her choices and a little glue speak for themselves. The world took care of the rest. Months passed. The neighborhood on Maple Street returned to normal. The rental house where everything had happened was eventually sold to a young family with 2 children. They had no idea of its infamous history. No clue that the driveway they parked in once held a viral scandal that shook the entire community. Every so often, a neighbor would bring it up in passing. "Hey Richard, whatever happened to that fitness instructor who used to live in your wife's car?" Or, "Wasn't that the house where..." Richard would just smile faintly and say, "She moved on," and that was enough. Molly did move on, or at least she tried to. Her reputation in Boise never recovered. Even in Portland, whispers followed her. Job interviews came with awkward questions. Resumes had to be explained, and she never escaped the knowledge that a single video had defined her to the world. Travis fared no better. Once a confident personal trainer with dreams of opening his own gym, he was now working as a late-shift security guard in Sacramento. Anonymous, stripped of the validation he once craved from clients and social media followers. Richard, meanwhile, lived quietly. He kept his business steady, kept Chester by his side, and built something new with Catherine. His life wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And that was enough. So what do we learn from Richard's story? That revenge can be loud, violent, and messy, but it doesn't have to be sometimes. The most devastating revenge is the quiet kind, the kind that lets people fall into the trap of their own lies. Richard didn't force Molly to cheat. He didn't tell her to lie. He didn't push her toward Travis. He simply allowed her choices to unfold. And with a little twist of poetic justice, the world saw the truth. For years, Molly had played games behind Richard's back. But in the end, the game played her. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Betrayal has consequences. You can hide your phone, invent excuses, dress up your lies, but eventually, the truth surfaces. And when it does, it doesn't just break relationships. It breaks reputations. It breaks careers. It breaks entire lives. So if you've ever wondered whether lying your way out of a problem is easier than facing the truth, think again. Because somewhere, somehow, the truth always wins. And for Richard, That truth came not through screaming matches or divorce court drama, but through patience and a tube of glue. Today, Richard walks his dog in peace. He greets his neighbors without shame. He runs his business with pride. His life, though scarred, is intact. Molly, she will forever be remembered, at least in Boise, as the woman who turned her back on her marriage and ended up turning herself into a viral punchline. And Travis, he's a cautionary tale, a reminder that when you build your life on deception, it only takes one mistake for everything to collapse. This wasn't just a story about glue. It was a story about justice, about choices, about how betrayal, no matter how carefully hidden, has a way of sticking with you. So ask yourself in your own life, are you living in truth, or are you one bad decision away from being the star of the next viral cautionary tale?